going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to today's Solar and Climate seminar. Welcome to those of you here in person and also on Zoom. Before I introduce today's speaker, I just want to say that the next and final seminar of the semester will be 3 weeks from today on Wednesday, December 8th. And that will be 3 of our awesome graduate students, planning with 10 graduate students to begin graduate class. So please come back for that. But today I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Sarick Matzen. Sarick is a postdoctoral geochemist in the Fern lab and has long been interested in the toxic and dirty. He began his geochemistry career with nuclear waste disposal work at Lawrence Livermore National Lab as an undergrad. He made his way to community farming in California and Tennessee, and then to Berkeley, where he got his PhD in 2020 in soil geochemistry, working with soil food on arsenic phytoextraction. He's now landed in the summer lab, where he's taking a break from contaminants to work on the transport of iron nanoparticles in marine systems. Overall, Sarick is interested in promoting healthy and sustainable systems in soils and also in academic institutions through anti-oppressive practice.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation to be here and for being here in person and online. I was excited to get the invitation to talk about my dissertation research here on phyto-remediation of arsenic in urban agricultural soils. So my work started at this vacant lot in the city of Berkeley, California. Community groups were interested in planting an orchard there, but discovered arsenic. So we joined with these community groups to investigate some plant-based solutions to remove arsenic from the soils using the Fern, Pteris vittata, the great Fern. And then as for progress,
could somebody switch the slides so we can see the slides clearly?
So Satish, can you see the, so it's the same slide that he's pointing to that you see on Zoom.
Okay.
So if you want to
right.
use your mouse, you can point on the computer.
sure.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, yeah, thanks for that.
Yeah.
Yes, so we started working with this Fern, Pteris vittata, and then moved into some using some chemical imaging techniques to look at the chemistry of arsenic in the Fern rhizosphere. So that vacant lot in Berkeley is a part of a railroad right-of-way, the Santa Fe Railroad right-of-way that runs through South and West Berkeley. Berkeley overall has a reputation as an affluent community, but in fact mostly white community, but the south and west parts of the city have been historically marginalized areas, home to Black and then more recently Latinx residents. And this right-of-way here in other parts of the city had been previously developed into a very nice greenway, but here in South Berkeley, even as late as 2007 here, it was a vacant lot. And in fact, it was the last publicly or municipally owned public land, vacant land in the city of Berkeley. So a lot of people are interested in this land, including some urban agriculture groups who wanted to plant an orchard here in this lot. And in 2007, they got that approved by the city. They tested the soil and whoops, they found arsenic in the soil. Around 100 to 200 milligrams per kilogram, which is above acceptable thresholds and far above the background level in the East Bay of around 11 milligrams per kilogram. So arsenic, finding arsenic in railroad right-of-ways is not really a surprise. Arsenic pesticides have been applied to railroad right-of-ways around the world. It's particularly known to be a problem, interestingly enough, in Australia. But then we were surprised to, in a way it was still unexpected to find that right there in the middle of South Berkeley. Because when we think about urban contaminants, we often think about lead being a ubiquitous urban contaminant, and maybe think less about arsenic as a classic urban contaminant. But even here in the Twin Cities, we do have arsenic featured as an urban contaminant in South Minneapolis. Just to bring some local context here, this is a photo of an arsenic soil Superfund site in South Minneapolis, right by that's Hiawatha there. And this is the site of the former CMC Heartland Light Yard facility, which was an arsenic pesticide manufacturing plant. And in the process of manufacturing and then distributing the arsenic pesticides, they just left these huge piles of covered pesticides out in the open, such that pesticide dust was deposited over much of the East Phillips neighborhood. On railroad right-of-ways, arsenic-based pesticides have been applied both to control vegetation and to preserve the railroad ties, but then also to prevent rodents from burrowing into the freshly graded railroad grade soil, which is what we think happened on the railroad grade where we were working. So because this project was initiated with urban agriculture groups, they're very interested in a sustainable plant-based method to remediate arsenic. And arsenic phytoextraction was gaining currency both within research circles and also community circles as a potentially viable way to remove arsenic from soil while leaving the soil in place. This fern, Pteris vittata, the brake fern, is an arsenic-hyperaccumulator. And it can survive living in soils with very high arsenic concentrations by, instead of excluding arsenic from its roots like many plants do, this plant, because it's a hyperaccumulator, actually absorbs arsenic through its roots as arsenic-5 through the phosphate intake pathway, and then transfers the arsenic to its above ground biomass, where arsenic is stored in the reduced form, arsenic-3, in the penny vacuoles. The penny are the individual compound leaves of the fern front here. It is stored there at very high concentrations, well over 1,000 milligrams per kilogram arsenic, which is the threshold for what's known as arsenic hyperaccumulation. This fern is often described to be native to southeastern China and other parts of Southeast Asia. It's found all over the world. It's naturalized and also considered to be an invasive species. Notably, it's found in the US, it's found in the Mediterranean. So that led us to think that it might grow well in California, which is also a Mediterranean climate, but we were also somewhat concerned that it would become an invasive species there. It's already naturalized in Southern California, but not previously found in the Bay Area. So that botanical context gave us, a mixture of optimism, but also concern. And then we were also interested in the fact that this fern is well known to grow in relatively harsh habitats, not only ancient arsenic mines in China, but also it's often found on walls, like this one here. I took these photos in Tampa, Florida, when I went to a triple SA meeting there, and I walked out of my Airbnb and saw Pteris vittata growing on this abandoned church. So we were wondering how this fern that's both invasive and also adapted to these harsh niches, how it would do under cultivation. We thought perhaps that through nutrient application specifically, we would be able to optimize phytoextraction rates under field conditions, because phytoextraction rates were shown to be slow, leading to estimated remediation times on the order of decades to remediate soil with around the similar arsenic concentrations to what we found or had in our soils. So in order to optimize rates, we wanted to determine what controls arsenic phytoextraction rates, including nutrient application, soil texture, which affects arsenic availability. And then also we wanted to investigate rhizosphere activity and how that leads to release of arsenic from soil for uptake into the fern. In this work, we started with field studies, 2 field studies, which I'll talk about today. A 4-year field study in that community-based setting, and then also a 1-year field study. And then I moved to a meso-scale system, the soil column system, in order to more closely track arsenic uptake of the fern and compare that to arsenic concentrations in the soil, and then also, importantly, potential arsenic leaching from the soil during phytoextraction. And then finally, we used synchrotron X-ray based techniques to investigate arsenic chemistry in the plant rhizosphere. So in our first field study, the 4-year field study, this one we set up working in collaboration with community groups with a co-managed site here at the railroad right-of-way. What was serendipitous here was that as we worked with the soil, we realized that there's actually a soil texture gradient in this site. So across all of our fertilizer plots, we had both a sandy soil on one side of the plot, and then also, which we thought was fill brought in for the railroad grade. And then we also had the native East Bay clay on the other side of the plot. So that allowed us to look both at nutrient application and soil texture. Over 4 harvest seasons at the site, we learned a few things the hard way. For example, we learned that the fern, even in a relatively mild Mediterranean climate, is vulnerable to frost and freeze damage. We lost a lot of ferns 1 year. We then built a hoop house to protect from further frost and freeze damage. We practiced all sorts of other season extension techniques like covering with floating row cover, et cetera. So it really was a very agriculture-based project. Over the 4 years, we tracked arsenic concentrations in the fern, biomass, and then the remediation rate, kilograms of arsenic removed from soil per hectare per year, shown here on the y-axis. And then on the x-axis, I'm showing the harvest from the 4 years, 2013 through 2016. And in this panel here, I'm starting out showing the results from the sandy soil. And then in the colored bars, we see the different soil treatments. Compost, 2 forms of nitrogen, and 2 forms of phosphorus. So in the sandy soil, we didn't see an effect of nutrients on the remediation rate. We found that the ferns did respond positively in terms of greater biomass production with nutrient application, nitrogen and phosphorus, but then that just led to a dilution effect where they were actually taking up less arsenic, leading to the same remediation rate as in the control plots that didn't receive any nutrients. Whereas in the clay soil, we found that the ferns really didn't do very well. Not only was growth lower, biomass production lower in the clay soil, but then they did not respond well to nutrients. We saw lower remediation rates here with nutrient application, which didn't, I mean, that was not a successful outcome in terms of wanting to use Pteris to remediate that site. But it did, as time went on, lead us to become interested in why these rates were lower in the presence of nutrients, especially in the presence of applied phosphorus. So looking at a periodic table, we can see that arsenic and phosphorus are chemically similar. Arsenic appears right under phosphorus, And in soils at around circumneutral pH, they take a similar chemical form, at least when we're talking about oxidized arsenic, arsenic 5. So that led us to wonder if phosphorus could actually be interfering with arsenic uptake in the fern. So we wondered if phosphorus might be knocking arsenic off of sorption sites on the iron minerals where arsenic is usually found in certain soils, leading, therefore making arsenic more available for uptake, but then also actually blocking arsenic uptake into the fern at the phosphate intake pathway. And of course, if arsenic is removed from soil, but then not taken up into the fern, it could be vulnerable to leaching, which would be a concern. To further investigate these trends, we conducted a one-year field study at another arsenic-contaminated site in the Bay Area. The Richmond Fields, the UC Berkeley Richmond Field Station here, which you can see in this photo from the 1970s. The field station is over here. My field site was here where these trees are. And then adjacent to that, you can see this old sulfuric acid factory where pyrite ore was roasted to produce sulfuric acid. And then before the field station was established, the roasting products, the pyrite cinders here, which are purple, were distributed over this adjoining property, which formerly was a munitions plant, as sort of a consensual effort to decrease vegetation growth and therefore fire danger at this munitions plant. Both of these sites were Superfund sites, California State Superfund sites, and were largely cleaned up, although there are still a lot of pyrite cinders found at the Richmond Field Station, which led to me being able to have another field site there. At this site, we did a higher resolution job sampling the soil in order to overcome issues of arsenic heterogeneity in soils. Contaminants, especially, well, including arsenic, are often heterogeneously distributed in soils. So in phytoextraction work, it's very easy to track contaminant uptake into plant biomass, but it's often hard to correlate that with a significant change in soil contaminant concentrations. So we used a method called incremental soil sampling to try to get a really good baseline arsenic concentration in our plots. And we tracked arsenic uptake in the fern over time and measured pore water arsenic concentrations. So in this study, similarly to in the previous field study, we again did not see any effects of nutrients on arsenic uptake in the fern. So here we are seeing a fern that's well suited to growing in harsh conditions. But if we're trying to optimize arsenic uptake, it's not responding well to nutrient application. Instead, what we found when we conducted a mass balance comparing arsenic concentrations in soil to arsenic uptake in the fern, we found an arsenic deficit. Here on the x-axis, I'm showing soil arsenic depletion normalized to per kilogram soil. And here on the y-axis, I'm showing fern arsenic accumulation also normalized per kilogram soil. This line shows a one-to-one relationship between soil arsenic depletion and fern arsenic uptake, which is what we would want under phytoextraction. We would want everything removed from the soil to appear in the fern. But that's not what we found. We found that we saw more arsenic depleted from the soil and taken up in the fern, which could be a problem. It could indicate that we actually saw a lot of arsenic leaching, being lost from the soil to leaching during phytoextraction. At the end of the study, after 1 year, we found that we had taken up 3.6% of the initial arsenic in soil. we had about 86% of the initial arsenic remaining in the soil. And we were missing 10.5% of the initial arsenic, possibly lost to leaching. So we wanted to look more at rhizosphere chemistry to try to understand what it was about fern growth that was possibly enhancing leaching of arsenic. And we thought it could be related to nutrient scavenging, not for nitrogen or phosphorus necessarily, which weren't really affecting fern growth, but possibly for arsenic. I'm sorry, iron. For a lot of plants employ different nutrient scavenging processes, activities to help solubilize elements that are nutrients that are often found insoluble in soils, like iron, often found as iron oxides. And they increase the solubility of iron oxides through release of root exudates, dissolved organic carbon, and through various processes, including redox processes. The dissolved organic carbon can be oxidized to CO2, and the iron can be, the solid iron 3 can be reduced to more soluble iron 2, and therefore made available for uptake into the plant. That's fairly common. The interesting side effect here is that if the iron minerals are reduced, solubilized, then that could release any arsenic that's found on those iron minerals. And if the arsenic itself is not reduced, but stays as arsenic in the +5 oxidation state, that could be convenient for our goal of increasing arsenic phytoextraction, because we know that the fern primarily takes up arsenic-5 through the phosphate intake pathway. However, if due to this reducing power released through root exudates, arsenic is also reduced from arsenic-5 to arsenic-3, that could be counterproductive to our goal of optimizing arsenic phytoextraction. And we might, because the fern does not as readily take up arsenic-3. And furthermore, arsenic-3 is often considered to be more mobile in soils compared to arsenic-5 because it's a neutral species at certain neutral pH. So it doesn't stick to soil as well. We thought that might explain the loss of arsenic that we saw. So in order to take a closer look at arsenic oxidation states in soil, we turned to X-ray absorption spectroscopy. And here I'm showing energy on the x-axis and the normalized absorption of that energy into the arsenic on the y-axis here. And what we're interested in here is the peak position, where arsenic-5 absorbs energy at the position of this peak here, and arsenic-3 absorbs at a slightly lower energy over here, as shown at the red arsenic-3 standard, and then the blue down here is an arsenic-5 standard. So what we were really interested to find that the bulk soil primarily contained arsenic-5, but in contrast, we had about 50% arsenic-3 in the rhizosphere soil. So right away, we were able to establish that the rhizosphere was a distinct geochemical environment with respect to arsenic compared to bulk soil. We then used a related technique to chemically image the rhizosphere and look at arsenic oxidation states spatially resolved with respect to the root. So the root shows up here. It's the root cross section. It shows up as brown. And then everything else here is a soil grain. The 60 microns is about the width of a fine human hair. So this is all soil that's very close to the roots, within the roughly 1 millimeter distance from the root that could be considered to be the rhizosphere. And soil that was all adhered to the root. So we were expecting, in a way, or maybe I was naively hoping or envisioning a really nice gradient in arsenic oxidation state with respect to the roots. I thought that perhaps if the root is emitting all of these root exudates, then we would see reduced arsenic right next to the root and more oxidized arsenic further away. Which we see to a certain extent here in spots 1 and 2. We see more arsenic-free, predominantly arsenic-free. We also see a decent amount of arsenic-free here in spots 3, 4, and 5. Spot 6 is a bit of an anomaly. We see mostly arsenic 5, oxidized arsenic right there directly adjacent to the roots. And then we also see oxidized arsenic out here a little bit farther away. So we have maybe a weak spatial trend here. But a stronger trend is the relationship of the arsenic to the iron, where we see primarily oxidized arsenic, arsenic 5 in these iron hotspots. So again, that's confirming that arsenic and iron are associated in soils, and giving us a clue that arsenic and iron chemistry are probably related. We did see a really interesting spatial trend in the bulk soil, however, even though we didn't see it in the rhizosphere. So this is an aggregate of bulk soil, and this is the exterior out here on our left, and this is the aggregate interior, about the middle of the aggregate over here on our right. And typically in aggregates, we would expect to find oxidized conditions on the exterior where there's usually more access to oxygen in the soil. Whereas in the interior, we often find reducing conditions. However, here we found the opposite with respect to arsenic. We found more arsenic-free on the aggregate exterior and more arsenic-5 on the aggregate interior, which led us to hypothesize that maybe we're seeing export of arsenic-free. We're seeing arsenic-free reduced in the rhizosphere and then exported from the rhizosphere to the bulk soil and then possibly washed out of, on its way to being washed out of the soil during irrigation events, and therefore explaining that arsenic deficit that we saw, explaining all of that missing arsenic. And of course, in addition to export of iron or arsenic-free itself, we could also be seeing export of the root exudates, the dissolved organic carbon, which could be further fueling arsenic production in the bulk soil, leading to overall loss of arsenic, not only from the rhizosphere, but also the bulk soil. Just to summarize, again, we saw primarily arsenic-free in the rhizosphere, and even though we saw primarily arsenic-5 in the bulk soil, it does seem like we have evidence for arsenic leaching, especially of arsenic-3. So we then wanted to look more closely at arsenic leaching using a soil column approach, where we could compare arsenic uptake in the fern to arsenic concentrations in the soil and arsenic concentrations in the leachate. And also conduct or calculate a fern water balance in order to try to understand how transpiration would also affect the leaching of arsenic. So looking here at arsenic concentrations in the column effluent, we found that in fact arsenic did leach during phytoextraction. So here on the x-axis, I'm showing the time in weeks. It was a 22-week column study. And then here on the y-axis, I'm showing effluent arsenic concentrations in micrograms per liter. Again, in this study, I worked with two soil textures, a coarse textured soil and a medium textured soil. And in both cases, we saw around 150 micrograms per liter arsenic in the effluent. So that right away was a cause of concern. Then we were really interested in noticing the differences in arsenic in effluent concentrations in both the planted columns shown in the closed circles and in the unplanted columns shown in the open circles. So we see that there's an increase in arsenic concentrations in the presence of fern growth compared to the absence of fern growth, suggesting that fern growth itself is increasing leaching of arsenic, possibly associated again with nutrient scavenging, especially iron. We were also, because we knew exactly how much water we had input into the system, we were also able to calculate that most arsenic appeared to be mobilized right in the fern rhizosphere, as opposed to a bulk soil. We calculated how much water the fern took up through transpiration, and then based on the arsenic concentrations in the bulk pore water, we found that the bulk pore water accounted for less than 30% of the arsenic taken up into the fern, shown here in the white part of the bar, which then led us to assume that most of the arsenic in the fern actually came from other sources, probably arsenic release in the rhizosphere pore water, which would have had extremely high arsenic concentrations, and therefore suggesting that even though overall during phytoextraction we see arsenic leaching from bulk soil, most arsenic that's actually phytoextracted, taken up into the fern, is taken up from the rhizosphere directly adjacent to roots. So in other words, during phytoextraction, we're really using two remediation processes, if you will. We're using phytoextraction to remediate rhizosphere soil, but then we're using what might optimistically be called monitored natural accumulation, or attenuation rather, to leach arsenic out of the soil, arsenic that hopefully is been sorbed to lower soil horizons and does not reach groundwater. So a few take-home messages. Overall, we found that this fern, which is a well-known invasive species, used to growing in harsh conditions, does not respond well to nutrient application, at least in terms of our goal of increasing arsenic phytoextraction rates. On the other hand, iron scavenging appeared to be closely related to arsenic uptake in the fern. And then due to those iron scavenging, nutrient scavenging activities, we actually promote arsenic leaching during phytoextraction. Growth increases arsenic concentrations in leachate, but the fern is only taking up a very small portion of the total arsenic lost from soil. Again, we found that phytoextraction occurs primarily in the rhizosphere, but that arsenic leaching occurs from both, we are hypothesizing both rhizosphere and bulk soil. And so therefore, during phytoextraction, we really need to measure arsenic concentrations in leachate and move away from this sort of extractive point of view to considering a more system scale approach where we look at downward migration of arsenic as well as extraction of arsenic in soil. So just to close, I want to return to the community-based nature of this work. As we were, realizing that arsenic phytoextraction really wasn't the way to go in this case to clean up that vacant lot in preparation for urban agriculture, we continued with soil sampling activities. Leadership changed at the Berkeley Community Gardening Collaborative, and that brought in this, under the leadership of project coordinator Corinne Haskins, that brought in this very strong environmental justice focus to the work, where she really promoted this interest in furthering youth environmental education in the area, specifically working with youth from South Berkeley, many of whom are low income and youth of color. So we got some grants to fund a program called Moving South Berkeley Forward, and started out with the mission of sampling the soil in all 6 of those vacant lots. That turned out to be overly ambitious. And in fact, then we began to feel like this, an organization that was really about mentoring youth of color shouldn't be sampling the soil for the city of Berkeley, because that's essentially more free. I mean, the students were actually getting paid, so it wasn't exactly free labor, but let's just say it was very low cost labor provided for free to the city of Berkeley when it was their land, and we felt like actually they should be the ones testing the soil and furthering cleanup goals there. So we moved away from soil sampling to youth environmental education, and also with a strong grant writing component. Corinne was able to secure city funding to fund this program, come up with a really nice design for developing those lots. Hired one of my former interns, Cahill, to be another project coordinator. And this organization is doing great. I mean, it's amazing what happens when you have leadership directly from the affected communities and also resources, municipal institutional support. So I think it's a really exciting outcome of the project that although we weren't able to use this sustainable plant-based method to clean up the site, instead this program got started and is flourishing. And the city now appears to be on board with moving ahead with actually excavating the soil and setting up a variety of mixed use spaces there, including some urban farms. So with that, I'd like to thank all of you for being here online and in person. I'd like to acknowledge my funders, committee members, and interns. And I think there's some time for questions. Should I stop sharing now?
Yeah, you can stop sharing.
I have questions, of course. I wanted to know, I think I missed, do you plant these as like baby fern? Like what is the best success with phyto-remediation? Is it transplanting mature plants or things from seed or seedlings or yeah? And what did you do?
We transplanted young ferns. We grew some of our, when the project started, we purchased about $10,000 worth of ferns from a nursery in Florida. Well, that's associated with Eden Space Corporation, which is a corporation associated with some of the original researchers who discovered this plant as an arsenic-hyperaccumulator. And they actually patented arsenic uptake in this fern. And so now they sell the fern and retain the patent for use of this fern for arsenic phytoextraction purposes. So we purchased ferns, but then we also got permission to reproduce the fern from spores for research purposes only. So we also grew them from spores. That was a fun side project. But I think most people buy and then plant young ferns with maybe 4 to 6 months.
Just like you would get like saplings for your garden.
Yeah.
And my other question was, so given that it was, other people have shown it was a good hyperaccumulator, all of your work on soil texture and the different things, like, what do you think the main reason it was not a super great strategy for that particular contaminated site? Now, given what you know now, or do you think the previous research is bogus and they just focused on the fact that it could hyperaccumulate some?
Well, I think that it is both an excellent hyperaccumulator, but then also, I mean, if you're just looking at arsenic uptake in the fern, but then I think that phytoextraction is limited by a mass problem, where researchers in China actually established a whole arsenic phytoextraction remediation sort of campus at an ancient arsenic mine site. And also at a number of farmland sites, they've been able to show that over several years, you can successfully decrease arsenic concentrations from about 50 milligrams per kilogram down to 30, which I believe is the relevant threshold in China. Whereas I think if you're working with more than 50 milligrams per kilogram, just as a ballpark figure, I think you're really facing a mass issue. And then I think the other issue is it's not super well understood how arsenic remediation rates or uptake rates would change over time. So we showed that in the sandy soil, there wasn't any significant change over 4 years. But other people have suggested that, and it makes sense that over time, there's going to be a decrease in uptake rates as the more available arsenic is taken up and you're left with less available arsenic, and then you have to deal with issues of resupply as arsenic moves from less available fractions in the soil to more available fractions. So that is to say, it's not, so you typically people like to and this is what I did, I estimated remediation times just based on a linear decrease of arsenic in soil, but I think really you would see some sort of a plateau. So I think people have shown that you can effectively remediate less, but then if you're dealing with more, then your plateau is going to be higher, and you're not going to be able to just grow ferns for decades and decades and eventually reach background levels.
So if the Berkeley site were more contaminated, you think it would be more effective?
No, if it were more contaminated, I think it would be less effective. And we saw our best remediation rates there are some soils there that had about 50 milligrams per kilogram arsenic, and that's where we saw the best rates. So it seems best suited to remediate soils with low arsenic concentrations to begin with. Concentrations that are just slightly higher than acceptable levels.
Oh, cool, thanks.
In our case, they were incinerated, and that's, I mean, that's potentially problematic depending upon the success of the smokestack scrubbers at the incineration facility. Research in China, researchers have shown that at facilities there, it's important to use better scrubbing mechanisms in order to, because arsenic is volatilized during incineration. So yeah, another sort of problematic aspect of this is dealing with the waste. And in fact, over time, it just became clear that even if, the more effective phytoextraction is, the more toxic the ferns are. So then if it were to be a community-based project, I mean, even working with undergrads who were like excellent students, we found that we had to be really adamant about following proper safety protocols. And so, I mean, it just began to seem like it's, you know, it's too toxic for a community-based application. You really need to have well-trained people working with this toxic biomass.
Sarick, there is one question in the chat. I can read it out, or okay.
Oh, yes. Yes, so arsenic 3 will come back in the soil after decomposition of the fern. So how is remediation of arsenic possible with the help of fern? Yeah, this is a cool question because it gets to the issue of, again, of arsenic cycling within the fern system. And in fact, if the biomass is not harvested, then absolutely it, arsenic has been, so arsenic is sort of it's effectively held in the fern biomass when the fern is alive and it's reduced, it's kept under reducing conditions sequestered in the vacuoles. But then when the fronds dry, the arsenic oxidizes, and then it's actually able to really easily leach out of the fronds. So then if you don't harvest the fronds, you know, if you have a naturally occurring population growing on an arsenic contaminated site, and the fronds are just senescing, dying, and then falling back to the soil right there, then you have decomposition and you are returning the arsenic to the surface soil. And we saw some results that did hint at basically phyto-enrichment of arsenic in the surface soils, which has been shown in other hyperaccumulator-based naturally occurring ecosystems, where you do have ferns taking up, especially nickel from lower soil horizons, cycling it through the plants, and then depositing it on the soil surface through litter fall. Yeah.
Do you know why the fern hyperaccumulates arsenic? What benefit does that give it?
I have been really interested in that, and there are a number of theories. I think the one that makes the most sense to me is what's known as the phosphorus starvation theory, which kind of gets at what we were seeing about how the fern is releasing arsenic as a byproduct of nutrient scavenging activities, because it evolved under low phosphorus conditions, is the idea. And other theories involve possible pest control, and yeah, actually, I think there's one more theory that I can't remember right now.
Pest control, like so the fern doesn't get eaten.
Yeah,
It's
so that,
poisonous?
yeah, you would sort of, natural,
Interesting.
yeah, kill off large populations of pests. We saw all kinds of pests growing on them. So I don't know, maybe there would have been more if the ferns weren't. But we didn't think about that. I mean, the city required us to put up signage that don't eat the ferns, but then the neighbors had free-range chickens, and then there's the worm issue. The soil, regardless of whether or not we were there, the worms potentially contain arsenic, and it's growing chickens, and yeah. So the pest issue is like funny, but also really serious. Or the transfer of arsenic from the biomass to flora, to fauna. Yeah.
The next step for the city is to activate. So then, how does that work? Are we have to, how do we get flow? What's the process there?
And can you repeat the question?
Sure. So the question is that, so the next step is excavating the soil. And could I talk about the process and how deep would excavation, what depth of soil would need to be excavated? And I'm not sure. I think I never did a depth profile there of arsenic concentrations, but just anecdotally, I can tell you that it's maybe that the fill at least is over a foot deep. Typically in, I mean, it depends what kind of remediation application you're talking about, but at least in residential yard remediation efforts, usually only the top foot is excavated and replaced with clean fill, which works if you're just talking about preventing exposure from surface soil, but doesn't necessarily work if you're also talking about things that involve digging into the soil, like planting fruit trees, for example. Whereas in a more industrial setting, I think it's common to excavate soil until the contaminated soil is gone. So that's usually a process of testing and then excavating and then testing again to make sure that you did actually remove everything. But in any case, it will be a lot of soil. And it will probably go to a hazardous waste facility in Utah. Yes, sort of euphemistically named like Green Valley. Yeah.
Arsenic studies currently?
I am continuing this work, or I will continue this work, moving towards more controlled systems and where we will grow the fern in sort of synthesized soils, add a certain amount of iron and a known amount of arsenic to try to understand that relationship between iron and arsenic uptake. And then we'll continue doing the chemical imaging work, and we should be able to image the arsenic and the iron depletion actually during growth, because it's possible to do that type of imaging on living ferns. So we'll be able to do a time series and look at how the arsenic and iron concentrations change. And then we'll also do some cool imaging of the soluble arsenic using other methods. So I think it's exciting to move from these sort of real life applications, but pretty complicated projects in order to really well-defined systems.
I think we're all set.
Yeah, thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you for being here.